The 1960s was an eventful period in the fight for civil rights. Cleveland was one of the places that the movement affected. There are many different important events that contributed or coincided with the riots in Cleveland that characterized the decade. One of the events was the end of the World War. African American men fighting in World War II experienced different treatment while in Europe while fighting. They saw how whites in Europe treated them more as equals and began to wonder why they were treated differently at home, which caused black veterans to begin to fight for more rights as a U.S. citizen. As the civil rights movement developed, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged with his nonviolent protest beliefs as a leader in African American rights. Martin Luther King Jr.'s success led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Act of 1965, which helped eliminate segregation and make voting more accessible to African Americans. In 1965, Malcolm X appeared into the spotlight with his more violent methods of protest. Later in the movement, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, which spurred violent protests around the country. Another factor that contributed to the movement was the Vietnam War that destabilized the country and gave the movement a more pliable audience to work with. The war lasted about 20 years from 1955 to 1975. The first large-scale riot to occur in Cleveland was the Huff Riot in 1966, which was also the largest riot of the decade in Cleveland. The violence began when a black man went into a bar for a glass of water. When he asked, the white bartender refused to give him the water and wrote "No water for Negroes" on a piece of cardboard and stuck it in the window of the bar. Once some others in the community heard about what happened, a large crowd started to gather around the establishment, angry about the incident. The police were called in to try and disperse the crowd, which made the crowd angrier, and they began to riot. As the police lost control, the people started to set buildings on fire and loot stores. The National Guard was called in to quell the violence, which lasted about 5 days. The second notable riot in Cleveland was called the Glenville Shootout, which consisted of an intense shootout lasting about 90 minutes and 3 days of rioting. The violence started when 5 police task force officers staking out a black national apartment that was suspected of having a stockpile of guns and ammo were shot at by about 20 to 25 armed black nationalists. Miraculously, none of the officers were hit, and backup was already on the way for a raid that was supposed to happen on the apartment. The outgunned police officers didn't have radio, which meant they were coming in blind against a force with shotguns and .30 caliber carbines, which outgunned the officers' revolver pistols. Due to the firefight, 3 officers, a civilian trying to help, and 3 black nationalists died. Also, about 12 officers were injured, with one who died later from his wounds. As the shootout began to end, the rioting began. The police were outmatched and the rioters began looting and set buildings ablaze. The next day, the National Guard arrived, but the mayor decided only African American officers would be allowed into the rioting area in hopes of preventing further outrage. The plan did not work, and the rioting got worse. Finally, the mayor conceded and let the rest of the police force and National Guard go in to stop the violence. Eventually, the police force and National Guard were able to stop the violence. Due to the violent events in the 1960s, Cleveland has become more unified in an effort to prevent more dangerous outbreaks from occurring.